In just 32 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved actresses went from sitting calmly on a chat show sofa to storming off set in front of millions of viewers after the host crossed a line that nobody saw coming. What started as friendly banter turned into a fiery argument that left the studio audience in complete shock. Cameras still rolling as Dame Judi Dench had absolutely enough and walked out, leaving Graham Norton speechless, and the show in total chaos. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Last night's episode of The Graham Norton Show was supposed to be a celebration. Judi Dench was there to talk about her latest film, a project she'd poured her heart into for over 2 years. The cameras were rolling, the audience was excited, and everything seemed perfect. She walked onto the stage to massive applause, waving to the crowd with that warm smile everyone knows and loves. Graham stood up to greet her, giving her a hug before she settled into the famous red chair. The conversation started off well enough. Graham asked about her new movie, and Judy lit up talking about it. She explained how the role challenged her, how she'd worked with an incredible director, and how proud she was of the final product. The audience hung on every word. She was funny, charming, and clearly passionate about her work. Graham laughed at her stories, and everything felt comfortable. Then Graham shifted gears. He brought up Judy's age, something he'd done before with other guests, usually in a joking way. But this time felt different. He made a comment about how impressive it was that she was still working at her age, still memorizing lines, still showing up on set every day. The way he said it had an edge to it, like he was genuinely surprised she could still function. Judy's smile faded just a bit. She responded politely, saying that age was just a number, and that she loved what she did. She wasn't going to stop just because some people thought she should. The audience clapped, clearly on her side. But Graham didn't let it go. He pushed further, making another joke about older actors and whether they could keep up with the younger generation. He laughed as he said it, looking to the audience for support. Some people laughed nervously, but others stayed quiet. You could feel the mood in the room shifting. Judy's expression changed completely. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked directly at Graham and said, "I'm not sure what you're trying to suggest, Graham, but I assure you I'm more than capable of doing my job." Her voice was calm but firm. There was a warning in her tone that anyone paying attention would have caught. Graham should have backed off right then. He should have apologized, made a self-deprecating joke, and moved on to another topic. But he didn't. Instead, he doubled down. He said something about how the industry was changing, how streaming services wanted younger faces, how it must be difficult for actors of her generation to stay relevant. He was still smiling, still acting like this was all friendly conversation. But his words were cutting. The audience had gone completely silent now. People were looking at each other, uncomfortable with where this was going. Judy sat up straighter in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke again, her voice was ice cold. "Graham, I've been acting since before you were born. I've won every award there is to win. I've worked with the greatest directors and actors in the world. I don't need to justify my relevance to you or anyone else." The audience erupted in applause. People were cheering, standing up, showing their support for her. Graham's smile finally faltered. He tried to laugh it off, saying he was just joking, that she knew he didn't mean anything by it. But Judy wasn't having it. "You weren't joking," she said firmly. "You were being disrespectful." "There's a difference." Graham's face went red. He wasn't used to being called out like this on his own show. He tried to regain control of the situation, saying that he had the utmost respect for her and her career, but his voice had an irritated edge to it now. He was getting defensive. "I think you're overreacting a bit," he said, forcing a laugh. "It was just a bit of banter." That was the wrong thing to say. Judy's eyes flashed with anger. "Overreacting? You've spent the last 5 minutes implying that I'm too old to do my job and you think I'm overreacting?" The tension in the studio was unbearable now. The cameramen didn't know where to point their cameras. The producers in the control room were probably freaking out, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial. But the cameras kept rolling. Graham tried to move on. He picked up his cards, looking at his next question, clearly hoping to change the subject. But Judy wasn't done. "No, Graham. We're not moving on from this. You owe me an apology." Graham looked up from his cards, surprised. The audience was completely silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Graham's jaw tightened. You could see him weighing his options, trying to decide how to handle this. "An apology?" he said, his tone sharper now. "For what? For having a conversation? For doing my job as a host? For being rude and dismissive?" Judy shot back. "For treating me like I'm some relic from the past instead of a working actress who's still at the top of her game." Graham set his cards down on the table, harder than necessary. The sound echoed in the quiet studio. "Dame Judi, with all due respect, I think you're being a bit too sensitive. We joke around on this show. That's what we do. If you can't handle a bit of humor, maybe you shouldn't be here." The audience gasped. Some people booed. Graham had just told one of the most respected actresses in the world that maybe she shouldn't be on his show. The look on Judy's face was pure fury. "Too sensitive," she repeated, her voice rising. "You disrespect me on national television, and I'm too sensitive?" Graham threw his hands up. "I didn't disrespect you. You're twisting everything I said." "I'm not twisting anything," Judy said, her voice shaking with anger now. "Everyone here heard exactly what you said. You think because you're the host, you can say whatever you want without consequences? I think because I'm the host, I can run my show the way I see fit." Graham snapped back. "And I don't appreciate being lectured by a guest." The audience was in complete shock. People were murmuring to each other, phones out, recording everything. This was nothing like the fun, light-hearted show people expected from Graham Norton. This was a full-blown confrontation happening live. Judy stood up from her chair. The movement was sudden, and it made everyone in the studio freeze. She looked down at Graham, who was still sitting, and her expression was one of complete disappointment. "I have never been treated with such disrespect in my entire career," she said, her voice steady now but filled with emotion. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to share my passion with your audience. Instead, you turned it into an opportunity to make me feel small." Graham stood up too, facing her. "You're making this into something it's not," he said. "You're creating drama where there doesn't need to be any." "I'm creating drama?" Judy said, her voice rising again. "You started this, Graham. You could have apologized at any point. You could have admitted you crossed a line. But instead, you're standing here, blaming me for being upset about your behavior." Graham's face was bright red now. His hands were clenched at his sides. "Fine. You want an apology? I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt. There. Happy now?" The audience booed loudly. That was the worst apology anyone had ever heard. Judy just shook her head, looking at him with a mixture of anger and pity. "That's not an apology, Graham. That's you being a coward." Graham's eyes went wide. "Excuse me? You heard me," Judy said, not backing down an inch. "A real apology would be you admitting that what you said was wrong, not just saying sorry if I was too sensitive to handle it. But clearly, you don't have the guts to do that." Graham took a step closer to her. "Don't you dare come on my show and call me a coward." "Then don't act like one," Judy fired back instantly. The two of them were standing face to face now, and the energy in the room was explosive. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people were cheering for Judy. Others were just sitting in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were witnessing. "You need to sit down," Graham said, his voice low and dangerous. "Sit down, and let's finish this interview professionally." Judy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Professionally? You lost any claim to professionalism when you decided to insult me instead of interviewing me." "I didn't insult you," Graham shouted, finally losing his composure completely. "You're just looking for a reason to be offended." "Don't you dare raise your voice at me," Judy said, her own voice getting louder. "I am not some young actress you can push around. I am Dame Judi Dench, and I will not be spoken to this way." Graham pointed toward her chair. "Then sit down and act like it." The audience booed even louder. People were shouting at Graham, telling him to apologize, telling him he was wrong. But Graham wasn't listening. He was too angry, too invested in being right. Judy took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, but absolutely final. "I'm not sitting down, Graham. I'm leaving." She turned away from him, heading toward the side of the stage. Graham called after her, his voice desperate now. "Judy, wait. You can't just walk off." She stopped and turned back to look at him one last time. Watch me. Graham threw his hands up in frustration. This is ridiculous. You're being completely unreasonable. I'm being unreasonable? Judy repeated, her voice rising again. You insulted me, dismissed my concerns, gave me a fake apology, and now you're angry that I won't sit here and take it. You're the one being unreasonable, Graham. I run this show, Graham shouted. I decide what happens here. Then you can run it without me, Judy said coldly. She started walking again, and Graham wasn't about to let her have the last word. He called after her, his voice echoing through the studio. Fine, leave. If you can't handle a simple conversation without throwing a tantrum, then maybe you're not as professional as you think you are. Judy stopped dead in her tracks. The audience gasped. Graham had just called her unprofessional on live television. She turned around slowly, and the look on her face made Graham take a step back. What did you just say? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Graham, to his credit or maybe his stupidity, didn't back down. You heard me. You're throwing a tantrum like a child because I made a few jokes. That's not professional. Judy walked back toward him, and you could see Graham tense up. She stopped a few feet away from him, looking him dead in the eye. Let me make something very clear to you, Graham, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I have been a professional for over 60 years. I have worked through injuries, through personal tragedies, through everything life has thrown at me, and I have never once let it affect my work. But I will not stand here and let you insult me, and then call me unprofessional for defending myself. Graham opened his mouth to respond, but Judy held up her hand. No, you've said enough. More than enough. You had multiple chances to do the right thing tonight, and you chose not to. You chose your ego over basic human decency. And that says everything anyone needs to know about you. The audience erupted in applause and cheers. People were standing up, clapping, shouting their support for Judy. Graham looked around at the audience, realizing that he'd completely lost the room. Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? He said, his voice bitter. I'm the villain because I didn't bow down and grovel? You're the bad guy because you treated a guest with disrespect and then refused to take responsibility for it, Judy said simply. This isn't about ego, Graham. This is about basic respect. Graham laughed harshly. Respect? You want respect? You've done nothing but attack me for the last 10 minutes. I defended myself. Judy corrected him. There's a difference. You attacked me first, and when I called you out on it, you got defensive and made it worse. Everything that happened tonight is because of choices you made. Graham shook his head, looking genuinely baffled. I cannot believe this. I cannot believe you're making such a big deal out of nothing. That's the problem, Graham, Judy said, and her voice was sad now, disappointed. You think this is nothing. You think insulting someone and then dismissing their feelings is nothing. That's why you'll never understand what you did wrong. She turned away from him for the final time. Graham made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. If you walk off this stage, everyone's going to know you couldn't handle a simple interview. Judy didn't even turn around. She just called back over her shoulder, her voice clear and strong. No, Graham. Everyone's going to know that you couldn't conduct a simple interview without being an arse. The audience went absolutely wild. People were cheering, laughing, clapping. Some were recording on their phones, knowing they were witnessing television history. Graham stood in the middle of the stage, his face a mixture of anger and shock, unable to believe what had just happened. Judy walked straight to the side of the stage where the producers and crew were standing. You could see them trying to talk to her, probably asking her to stay, to give Graham one more chance. But she shook her head firmly, her decision made. Graham called out one more time from the stage, his voice cracking slightly. Judy, please, let's just talk about this. But she was done talking. She grabbed her bag from where it was sitting backstage, thanked the crew members who tried to apologize to her on Graham's behalf, and headed toward the exit. The cameras followed her the whole way, capturing every second of her departure. Graham stood alone on the stage, the audience still buzzing with energy, most of them clearly on Judy's side. He looked lost, like he couldn't quite process what had just happened to his show. He tried to address the audience, to explain his side of things, but people weren't interested. They were talking amongst themselves, showing each other their phone recordings, discussing what they'd just witnessed. The cameras caught Judy one last time as she reached the studio door. She pushed it open, walked through without looking back, and let it close behind her with a definitive click that you could hear even over the noise of the audience. And just like that, Dame Judi Dench was gone, leaving Graham Norton standing on his own stage, facing an audience that had just watched him spectacularly fail to handle one of Britain's most beloved actresses. The show that was supposed to be a fun celebration had turned into a disaster, and it was entirely his fault. The studio lights seemed harsh now, the red chairs empty except for Graham standing there awkwardly. He tried to make a joke to the audience, something about the show never having a dull moment, but barely anyone laughed. The energy had completely shifted. What was supposed to be entertainment had become uncomfortable, a reminder that even the most beloved hosts could get it wrong. Graham finally sat back down in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked at the cameras, knowing millions of people were watching, knowing that this would be replayed over and over again on social media, news sites, and talk shows around the world. He'd started the evening as the charming host everyone loved. He was ending it as the man who drove Dame Judi Dench off his show. The producers were probably scrambling in the control room, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of the episode. But there was no coming back from what had just happened. The moment Judy walked out that door, everything changed. People in the audience were still filming on their phones, capturing Graham's reaction to the whole disaster. He tried to compose himself, to get back into host mode, but you could see the shock and frustration written all over his face. He shuffled his cards, took a sip of water, and attempted to address what had just happened. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, trying to inject some levity into his voice. But it fell flat. The audience just stared at him, waiting to see if he'd actually take responsibility for what happened. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging his role in the confrontation, Graham tried to move on. "We still have a great show lined up for you tonight," he said, gesturing to the other guests who were supposed to appear. But his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. He knew, and everyone watching knew, that nothing else that happened tonight would matter. The only thing anyone would remember was the fight with Judi Dench. Backstage, you could hear the commotion as producers rushed around, probably trying to convince Judy to come back, or at least to make sure she was okay. But based on how determined she'd looked when she walked out, there was no chance she was returning to that stage tonight. Graham glanced toward the exit she'd used, and for just a moment, his confident host persona completely dropped. He looked genuinely shaken, like he was only now realizing the magnitude of what had happened. He'd just had a massive public falling out with one of the most respected figures in British entertainment, and it had all been caught on camera. The audience remained restless, people whispering to each other, some shaking their heads in disappointment at how Graham had handled things. A few audience members got up and left, not interested in watching the rest of the show after what they'd just witnessed. The empty seats served as a physical reminder of how badly things had gone. Graham tried once more to address the elephant in the room. "Look, things got a bit heated there," he said, his voice more serious now. Emotions run high sometimes in live television. But he still didn't apologize. He still didn't admit that he'd been in the wrong. And that made everything worse. Someone in the audience shouted, "You should apologize." Others murmured in agreement. Graham heard them. You could see it in his face. But he pressed on, determined to maintain some sense of control over his own show. "Let's bring out our next guest," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The band started playing, trying to inject some energy back into the room, but it felt hollow after everything that had happened. The stage door where Judy had exited remained closed, a silent reminder of the confrontation that had just taken place. Graham kept glancing at it, as if part of him expected her to come back, to give him a chance to make things right. But that door stayed shut. The rest of the guests for the evening were probably backstage, watching monitors, seeing what had just unfolded. They were probably wondering what they'd walked into, whether they should even come out now, whether appearing on the show tonight would look like they were taking Graham's side. Graham stood up from his chair again, trying to reset the energy in the room. He walked to the front of the stage, addressing the audience directly. "We've had some incredible moments on this show over the years," he said. "Not all of them go the way we plan, but that's live television for you." He was trying to frame it as just another unexpected moment in a long career of live TV. But everyone knew this was different. This wasn't a funny technical glitch or a silly mistake. This was a serious confrontation where he'd consistently made the wrong choices, and a legendary actress had walked out because of it. The cameras were still rolling, still capturing everything. Social media was probably exploding right now with clips of the argument, people taking sides, analyzing every word that was said. The moment Judy walked out that door, this became the story that would dominate entertainment news. Graham walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. He picked up his drink and took a long sip, clearly trying to collect himself. The confidence and charm he usually radiated were nowhere to be seen now. He just looked tired and stressed. The audience was still unsettled. The energy in the room completely different from the start of the show. What should have been a fun evening of entertainment had turned into something uncomfortable and tense. And all of it could have been avoided if Graham had just apologized when he had the chance. But he hadn't. He'd chosen pride over humility, ego over empathy, and now he was sitting in the wreckage of his own making, trying to figure out how to get through the rest of the show. The empty red chair next to him, the one Judy had sat in, seemed to mock him, a physical reminder of his failure to treat a guest with the respect she deserved. Outside the studio, Judi Dench was probably already in her car, heading home, done with the whole mess. She'd made her point, defended herself, and refused to tolerate disrespect. She'd walked away with her dignity intact, leaving Graham to deal with the consequences of his actions. And in that studio, under those bright lights, with cameras still recording and an audience still processing what they'd witnessed, Graham Norton was left to face the reality that he'd just experienced one of the biggest disasters of his career, and it was entirely his own fault.